Hello and welcome. My name is David Ramos, and joined with me will be Joel Carvajal and Alex Ride. And together for the Amy Zett High Impact Showcase, we will be diving into what we felt was the most influential part of our course as undergraduate learning assistants in General Chemistry 1 and Organic Chemistry 1, which will be Bloom's taxonomy.
So, really, what we're trying to understand here is how undergraduate learning assistants, the ULAs, use and emulate Bloom's taxonomy, all the different levels of it, both inside and outside of lecture. And that Bloom's taxonomy, it starts with knowledge and goes through to comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And to tell you a little bit more, we have Joel.
Okay, so the lowest level of understanding of the hierarchy is knowledge, and it focuses on just the mere retention of concepts. And then learners move on to comprehension, which is achieved when they can explain concepts in their own words instead of just what is written on the page, as well as comparing and contrasting with other ideas. Once learners have achieved comprehension, they can begin to apply their new understandings to their to the context that they're learning in, so in this case, chemistry. And then we get to analysis, which refers to a learner's ability to think critically in the context of what they are learning in. So this essentially refers to being able to use those problem-solving skills and being able to break down complex concepts into simpler parts. Then we get to synthesis, which is achieved when a learner is able to create something novel using their new understanding and every other skill before. Then lastly, we have evaluation, which is achieved when the learner can make judgments and critiques while utilizing every other skill below evaluation. So now I will hand it over to David to discuss the applications of the taxonomy inside and outside a lecture.
Thank you, Joel. So I will go into how we utilized each level of Bloom's taxonomy inside the lecture hall and outside the lecture hall. Inside the lecture hall, we are learning assistants. Our job is to help facilitate learning amongst the students. Outside lecture hall, we almost took on the full teacher role. For example, Joel and I held office hours together every Friday, and Alex held office hours every Saturday. And that'll be the examples I use for when we go into the outside application of lecture. But inside the application lecture, we'll start with knowledge. For example, leading students to the knowledge source is our most critical point of the knowledge terminal. We are there to help facilitate learning. An example of this will be, here's the periodic table we need. Then we move on to comprehension, which is where we ask general and broad questions to help get students thinking. For example, what is a double bond? Then we move on to application, which is my favorite part when we ask guided questions. This is where you help lead students to the correct answers without just giving it to them. This is where you ask questions that help get them to the right mind of thinking. For example, okay, why do we need to look at the electronegativity for those bonds? Then we move on to analysis, which is where you break down and compartmentalize different aspects of different problems. For example, if we need to find the percent yield, we have to find the theoretical yield. And in order to do that, we need the limiting reactant. In order to do that, we need to balance the equation. So we break down these problems and we analyze what part we need first to get the second part to get to the answer eventually. And then we move on to synthesis, which is how we help students devise their own ways of solving problems. For example, if they're in lecture, they're learning a way to solve a problem, they're reading a way to solve a problem. But sometimes if they can think of the way to solve it themselves, they apply it much better. And this is when we get to evaluation in class, where they can evaluate themselves based on the problems presented on the board, based on the ways they got to the problems from how they analyzed it beforehand. And they all just kind of intertwine with one another inside the lecture hall and outside the lecture hall. If we move to outside the lecture hall, this is where we get into our personalized ways of teaching as ULAs. For example, every Friday we did a 2 hour office hours, Joel and I, where we did an hour of lecture followed by an hour of questions, an hour of group work essentially. And we started with knowledge, for example, helping students demonstrate the skills and information they need in order to succeed in this course. This started with our hour of lectures that came from gathering information from various sources to help the students understand the material better. Then we moved to comprehension, which is where we took those information, those knowledge nuggets, and put them into PowerPoints, diagrams, anything to help compare and contrast, ways to help the students learn better. And then we move to application. This is where we provide additional practice problems already worked out so the students can follow along, work on it together in groups or on the board, pretty much any way to help them facilitate a learning environment as a whole. And then we move on to analysis, which is where after the students solve through the problems, they will each go up to the board one by one, for example, and help each other pick off where each one left off, and that'll help cohesively flow the proper way to do practice problems for chemistry. And then we move to synthesis. Just like an application in lecture, we have students come up with ways where they think would be the best way to answer problems. For example, that mole to mole conversion ratio between the reactants or the products. There's so many ways to solve different problems. And here we do the same thing. We have students synthesize their own ways of solving problems. And then that's followed by the evaluation. For example, a Kahoot, a PowerPoint quiz, anything that'll help the students evaluate themselves or in a group essentially as well in the office hours to help them facilitate learning better. And now I will pass it on to Alex.
So, what all of this really means is that both inside and outside of lecture, ULAs are using every single level of Bloom's taxonomy to help and um, encourage students learning on every single level. And all of this is backed up with our sources and our bibliography. So, thank you guys very much for listening to our presentation and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all and take care.